Thank you. Can I welcome everyone to this, the 17th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent. Apologies have received from Dave McCletchy, and John Lamont will be attending as his substitute. There are no apologies. Item 1, decision to take business in private. The committee is invited to the items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Item 4 is proposed as a private item as it involves discussing our approach to the scrutiny of the Tribunals-Bill, which includes discussion of possible witnesses. Item 5 is consideration of draft Stage 1 report of the Victims and Witnesses Scotland-Bill, including our final conclusions and recommendations to the Parliament. And item 6 is consideration of a draft report on our inquiry into the effectiveness of the provisions of the Title and Conditions Scotland Act 2003, as you will recall, deferred from last week. Are members agreed we take items 4, 5 and 6 in private?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Item 2, transfer of prisoner health care. This, as members will remember, and of course some of our witnesses will recall, is a roundtable evidence session on the transfer of prison health care from the SPS to the NHS. You remember that we held an earlier evidence session on 20th November and agreed to review progress in 6 months' time. I therefore welcome to the meeting Anne Hawkins and Jane Miller from the National Prisoner Healthcare Network, Dr Leslie Graham from the Information Services Division of NHS Scotland, Dr Richard Grodin from the Glasgow Community Health Partnership, Joe McGee from NHS Forth Valley, Mark McEwen from NHS Grampian, Ruth Parker from the SPS, Frank Gibbons from HMP Barlinnie, and Pete White from Positive Prison, Positive Futures. And you can, if you remember what we did before, we let you sort of give evidence to us, but this time I'm going to ask members if they have any questions they want to put, and then if you just indicate to me, witnesses, who wants to come in, I'll make a list and call you and let you know when your turn to respond to it. Any members have any questions? John Finney.
Aware that John Lamont wouldn't be present this morning, sends his apologies,
as
does David McCletchy.
Thanks very much, Alison, thank you. And so we now have that in the record. John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask the panel here about information technology. Our papers refer to the introduction of vision, and in a lot of things we deal with on this committee, the compatibility of IT systems is very important. Can people comment on electronic records and in particular vision, please?
Ball rolling. Jane Miller, please.
The system that has been introduced in the prison service is called INPS Vision, which is one of the 2 main GP IT systems across Scotland now. Members might know that GPass was stood down some time ago, and there was a procurement event to pick 2 systems. So we chose Vision for the prison system, and it works as one system which works a bit like a GP practice with a lot of branch surgeries. So it's hosted in Mark's area in NHS Grampian, and it links all the prisons in one bit, but it also links into each board, so we can do things like electronic referral, etc. And it moves records around about prisons as well as in and out of the community.
Mr McEwen, you've been named in dispatches. Do you wish to
Yeah, I mean, Jane's exactly right. It's essentially the branch is Grampian and the satellites are the prisons, and just as Jane said, it allows information to electronically move with the prisoner.
Does it move with them? One of the things we had when we were at Polmont, Alison McInnes, there's that, in fact, what happened when the prisoner left Polmont, the records didn't go with them unless they had a GP. And of course, if they don't have a GP, there's a dead stop and halt there. Is that the case still? Yes, Dr. Grodin.
I can answer that one. The records can be transferred electronically, so they form, if the prisoner is in prison for a period of, for a sentence, a length of time longer than 6 months or longer, they will become registered with the Prison Health Service as their practice. Any time shorter than that, they will still be registered with their community GP practice, and therefore their records don't transfer in because of the logistics of the transfer. And that's in keeping with what would normally happen in the community setting, whereby somebody who was temporary resident in an area for a period up to 3 months would only register temporarily with the practice and would not deregister from their existing GP. So therefore, there should be no reason why the record, if somebody is registered with the prison healthcare practice, why their record wouldn't automatically transfer through as it would happen in the community once they were released from prison and registered with the practice in the community.
What can we do about them when they're not registered with a practice, when they've no fixed abode, or I think that's the issue, isn't it? What can we do there, or is there anything can be done there?
What I would say to that is that all residents in Scotland who are eligible for NHS services can register with a GP practice. When there should be no reason, GP practice should not be refusing people
I'm not
registration.
talking about refusing, I'm just saying they just don't do it. They disconnect themselves from anything. Is there any way that one can encourage?
Well, I think certainly what we try and do in Glasgow and Clyde is ensure that they have a registration prior to leaving the prison setting, and I would hope that would be reflected across the whole prison establishment.
John?
Well, there are certainly issues regarding people with dependency issues and indeed people who are homeless getting registration. And I wonder, when you talk about the record transferring if someone has a custodial sentence of greater than 6 months, if it's less than 6 months, can the prison health authorities access any record that may be available?
Ms Hopkins. Oh, sorry, Ms Miller, you're here.
Yeah, the 6-month guideline was really to try and not destabilise the prisoners' practice in the community, because if they're only in for a short time, what we didn't want to do was then destabilise their relationship with a GP in the community. But the prison healthcare staff can make a patient or a prisoner permanent at any time if there's a clinical need to do so. So if a prisoner is undergoing treatment or in waiting for a referral, then they can make that prisoner a permanent register, and the record will automatically then come in from the GP. In practice, what happens is that the prison healthcare staff, if they don't get it automatically, will try and contact the GP to get the records in.
I would have imagined that's the crucial bit.
Absolutely.
To me, it's immaterial where the record sits, whether a hard copy or an electronic copy. It's the information that's in there that's compelling. So is there any debate here that the prison authorities can't access the best possible information at an early point, which should be admission, and we do hear about procedures taking place within 24 hours of admission?
We also have the electronic emergency care summary as now ECS, which is available within prisons so that they can at least track their latest episode with a GP and their medication. So that's a kind of double check, if you like. If the prison healthcare staff can't get the GP on the phone, then they can use the electronic emergency care summary.
Mr Gibbons, you're nodding. So
yeah,
you just...
I was only going to come in to say that the emergency care summary is available for people coming in who are doing less than a 6-month sentence, and that's very useful because you can see the latest sort of interactions with their GP services. Or we can look if for example, they've made contact with hospital and they've recently been in hospital and discharged from hospital, you can see what the latest care being provided is. For homeless people going out who are asked to register but don't, they very often will make contact with somebody like the HAT team, and they would get in touch with us and we can make the information available quite quickly. The other issue that people have...
What's the HAT team?
Sorry, homeless addiction teams and people who pick up guys who don't have a fixed address, prisoners leaving who don't have a fixed address. And that is very useful as well. So
I think it's fair to say though that will vary across Scotland because different boards have got different standards of homeless services, so it won't be the same right across Scotland. That's a service in Glasgow, but it's not necessarily replicated right across Scotland.
Yeah.
You also care to comment about that then, if it's not replicated from their area? Yes, Mr McKeon.
Certainly we've tried to address some issues in relation to that in terms of the dental provision that we make. We have a specific dental community team that deal with homeless and substance misusers, and the idea is they go into the prison and treat them there and then pick them up upon their release. That's assuming that they're Grampian residents. So I think health boards are aware of trying to provide a continuity of care, and it's a two-way thing. I think it's something that I feel fairly strongly about in terms of people, not just at the health service try and provide continuity of care, but the prisoners themselves feel valid enough to access NHS services both in and out with prison. It's certainly a challenge.
I'll take Colin now, followed by Sandra. Right, Colin.
Thanks. My question's really backing onto one of the things that you said. I'm not 100% sure of what the process is when somebody goes in without a GP, short-term, long-term, whatever, and they're coming out and they, obviously we have a problem with they do not have, they're not registered with a GP, is what you said. And one of the things that I found in my constituency at this moment in time is we have, because of pressure on numbers on one or two of the surgeries now, the GP surgeries are now putting on almost a boundary as to where they want to go. How many people from inside that, or their patients are only from inside that boundary, and they're actually writing out to one or two other patients who are out with that boundary that they've set, asking them to find new GPs. Now, if somebody isn't registered and they are going into that area or just outside, it's maybe somewhere that they have dealt with before, what do we have, what would be the process of actually making sure that these people, homeless or otherwise, when they get back into the area, if it's an area like the one I've just described, that they will have access to a GP in the area?
I'm happy to explain the registration process. I mean, all practices do work within a practice-defined area, which is agreed with the health board, and the health board have a responsibility to deliver primary medical services to all of its population, regardless. So in an area where there potentially is a gap of postcode areas, then the health board would be within its rights to sanction another general practice to open in that area. As an example, just around the registration, practices cannot refuse to take anybody on any grounds. That's against their contract, and actually they could breach their contract, and and information needs to come back that that's happening so that health boards can act on that, because again, we can only act on it or deal with these issues if there's feedback coming back to that effect. Secondly, practices can't put people off because they change their boundaries. They can write to people and suggest they may want to look for another GP, but patients do not have to leave the practice on the basis of that because they're redefining their geographical area. So everybody should have access to a GP practice, and essentially GP practices can't refuse to take people on within their defined practice area. And the health board have a responsibility to deliver that. The other element is that registration services within each of the health boards, there is a registration department, and if people are having difficulty in accessing or knowing where GP practices are, if they contact the health board and the registration department, they will then allocate them to a GP practice within that area.
Can I just clarify, a GP cannot refuse to take somebody on within the geographical area as agreed with the board contract? That's absolute.
Unless they have closed their list, which has to be agreed with the health board because pressure of numbers or they have an illness. But the health board have a responsibility to ensure provision of services, and closed lists would be a very rare occurrence, and you would try and work around that. And as I say, you could sanction another GP practice to open in an area, which, to be honest, most GPs don't like the thought of somebody else opening down the road.
But a GP can refuse to have a patient after a while if there's problems. A big general word like that, but I think, is that wrong? Is that right? GPs can remove practices. The contracts with the practice actually, and patients register with the practice rather than individual GPs. Practices can remove patients from their list under certain circumstances where there may have been violence against one of the members of staff, where there may be other forms of aggression. So there are valid reasons, but these have to be justified. They then have to notify the health board at the end of each year how many patients they've put off their list, if they put any off, and the reasons for doing that. And that can be challenged by the boards, and the contract, again, could be challenged if they were perceived to be acting unfairly. John Finney doesn't appear to be convinced, so I'll come back to Colin, but John seems to be disagreeing. Sorry, well, Colin, are you going to... Let Colin first.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two things here. The first thing is I've obviously got some letter writing to do to this particular practice. But the other thing is, I still haven't really... is how... when we're talking in terms of the prison system here, how do we assure that these people who, it doesn't matter what length of time they are in prison, how do we ensure that they have access to a GP as they walk out the door? Is really, given the problems that we've heard in some surgeries, as I mentioned, how do we get these people assured of a place in a surgery?
I think, I can only speak for Glasgow, but we will act as the patient's advocate in ensuring that they're registered with a practice prior to them being released from prison. I don't know what happens in the rest of the country, but that for me would be the best model, is that everybody has been either allocated through the board or has been registered with a practice that has been arranged prior to them leaving prison.
Yeah, if I could just come in there, most prisoners in Glasgow they are, we arrange for them to be registered, particularly if they flag up with us they don't have a GP before leaving, and we do sort of provide an advocacy service. And in fact, we will contact the if there's any problems with the GP. We occasionally get prisoners phoning saying they've had a problem registering. We will contact the practice, and if we can't get them in that practice, we'll find an alternative.
Mr McGee, what about Forth Valley?
I think the issue around Forth Valley is quite problematic, because obviously 3 national prisons, then most of the prisoner population is actually not from Forth Valley, so it's been able to communicate with other boards across Scotland, so it is a problem at times for us within Forth Valley. But I think the really onus is on the nursing staff working within the prisons to work with the prisoners to encourage them prior to release to engage with their GP, or actually to register for a new GP. So I think there's a lot of onus on the healthcare staff within the prison establishment itself to encourage and facilitate that. But it is, as I say, quite a noted problem with dealing with 3 national prisons, having prisoners from all over Scotland being released. But I think, to me, there's a real issue. We talk about through care. To me, I think, from a health perspective, what we're looking at is continuity of care, continuing that through. So I think we tend to talk in terms of continuity, and it's certainly very much encouraged with the nursing staff working in the prison establishments that there's this continuity of health care on the point of release.
Yes.
So I was just going to also mention there's the partnerships that have just been set up with SACRO and the WISE group, which is looking at new routes, and that's one of the things that I've been having discussions with them around this particular issue of encouraging people to register with GPs. So once the prisoner has got a mentor, then we've offered to do some training on just kind of working through the system and how to contact practitioner services and get patients allocated. So it's something that we are actively working on with the third sector at the moment.
And in the national, as you say, where you've got things like Pullman and prisons that are national, how does that, are you doing that there? Is there because that's a different issue from might be a local prison? The New Routes programme is going to cover all of the prisons in Scotland, so it'll be something that we will try and encourage them to do. So if, for example, if they've got a prisoner who's sitting in Forth Valley but comes from Lanarkshire, then we would make sure that they've got the appropriate contact in practitioner services for Lanarkshire. So it's about actually giving them the contact details so they know who to go to if they've got prisoners going out to other areas. Would that be followed through? It's one thing giving somebody a phone number or a contact, but actually following it through with them. The mentor would be the person that does it, not the prisoner. So the mentor would actually talk the prisoner through it and then follow it up as part of this new partnership that's been set up. Colin, John, you were disagreeing with this business of GPs.
Well, I don't doubt everyone in here is acting in very good faith and seek to have the best possible service delivered for everyone. Certainly the evidence we heard at the Equal Opportunities Committee in relation to gypsy travellers and my personal experience dealing with homeless people and particularly intravenous drug users is that general practitioners are far from welcoming and indeed such that one of the health boards actually provided a dedicated general practitioner for these people to visit because it's not always appreciated, but GP practices are commercial businesses. Now, I would favour a salaried practitioner model where someone's obliged to deliver health care, but I'm just saying that the evidence we've heard elsewhere in my personal experience doesn't mirror that. If that's changed, then I'm absolutely delighted.
How recent is that evidence and what was the...
that's certainly within the last 3 months, perhaps. In my personal knowledge, certainly within the last 6 months.
And what was the area that was refusing?
That was across Scotland, there was issues.
Dr. Gordon?
I'd just like to respond to that. I mean, what I've described is a contractual obligation on practice. What I haven't described is what may happen in practice in certain areas. Now, if there are concerns in certain areas, then I would suggest that if you're aware of these concerns, you take them up with your local health board, who can then act on them. because one of the great difficulties is actually obtaining any intelligence around the behaviours of certain practices. And these behaviours are frustrating for other practices locally, because they then bear the brunt of what should be a shared out population who can be more challenging. So I would absolutely agree with what you say, in that some people do not behave in the correct way and contractually correct. But what I've tried to describe is contractually what the obligations are in GP practices for taking patients on.
There's a follow-up for equal opportunities, John.
We're waiting to hear back from the government on that, and I'm sure we'll have some
There you
interesting
are.
response.
I've got Sandra, then Graham, then I've got leave my glasses, Alison. Sandra first, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, everyone. I think we're agreed that the transfer has been a good thing. It has made an improvement, but there's still some areas that we need to look at. Through care and continuity is one of them. But what I did want to ask about was substance misuse services, and just how through care that goes through to, from the prison right through to the various agencies as well. And is there any particular problems in certain health boards or certain prisons? I mean, I'm minded to ask of perhaps Addiewell and HNP Kilmarnock, as these are private prisons, and I just wondered if there's any, issues that you want to raise there, if there's more work that should be done on the through care and the misuse of, drugs, etc.
Who wants to take that on?
Start. One of the, this is clearly an issue, and we know that many people who are in prison have major drug and alcohol problems. And I think the previous evidence that you received, there was someone here from Phoenix Futures who spoke about the service that Phoenix Futures had provided to the Scottish Prison Service for some years under a contract. That has been reviewed by all health boards, and each board is at a varying stage of reorganising their addictions service. And I think it's fair to say that every health board has now created a different type of addictions pathway, and most are moving away from the Phoenix Futures contract. They already have done so, or are in the process of doing so. In Glasgow, in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, we've been reviewing our community addiction service. So the work on changing the shape of the service in the prisons, the 3 prisons, is being taken forward in tandem with work on reviewing the community addiction service. But I think it's fair to say everyone has got a new and revised addictions pathway, and has looked at the staffing that's required for the individual prisons. Where people have been moving the Phoenix Future staff over into the NHS, they move over. I think most people are moving them over, or most boards are moving them over under the transfer of undertakings regulations, so they chuppy over into the board. And because they're not necessarily qualified nursing staff, they don't necessarily fit into the NHS structures. So in some boards, individuals will have to be redeployed on again into other roles, and that may cause some consternation for the individuals. But as you know, in the NHS in Scotland, we look to redeploy staff. We don't make people compulsory redundant, so people will have a job. But the models are changing quite significantly, and maybe, Jane, I don't know if you want to add to that.
In terms of the network, we've just asked each board to give us a summary of what their addictions and substance misuse services are, and certainly some of the papers you might have had as private papers. So we are collecting that information, and the plan maybe in a few months' time is to have a kind of workshop day and just see what all boards are doing. But I think every single board has introduced a new substance misuse pathway. Some are further ahead than others, but the main aim is to integrate the substance misuse services from within prison into the community addiction services, so which will allow them to be picked up while in prison and then followed up when they go back into the community. The difficulty there, as Joe said, is from some of the national prisons where they don't necessarily go back into that board area, so they might be picked up by substance misuse services within Forth Valley, but then go back to Lanarkshire, Grampian or wherever, so that can cause some issues. But it's something that the network's focusing on over the next few months.
Mr. White, you wanted to?
I think it's fantastic that we're having this discussion at a time of tremendous change. The state of flux for prisoners with the new Change Fund programmes coming through, for some of them anyway, but also for the NHS, the way they've been integrated into the prison service, represents a fantastic opportunity to rebuild rather than retain some of the procedures and practices from before. The people that we're talking about are ones who have had a sense of cultural agoraphobia before they came to prison. They're given an institutional life in prison, and then when they're released, there's still a sense of cultural and personal agoraphobia. In general, they're profoundly disadvantaged in many ways. And I think that the idea of networks, systems, procedures, plans and pathways, whilst comfortable language around here, are alien territory for many prisoners, and when they become human beings and citizens again in the community. And I think it's important that we make an effort to remember that. I think many of us here will have encountered people in the medical profession who, whilst very well trained and perhaps well intentioned, they can be quite fearsome and they can be quite foreboding. And for someone who's been in prison to go and knock on a GP's door to ask for help and be told no, the idea of them actually taking a complaint anywhere is verging on farcical. And I think that we need to find some way of helping these people not reintegrate, but integrate. We need to bring this process to where we're dealing with human beings who've had a difficult and complicated start or a difficult and complicated part of their life, perhaps through their own hand. But I still think we have to help, and we have to go with the open hand of help, rather than saying, well, come and knock on my door, and I might say no, and if not, you'll have to go and complain somewhere. So let's get people into this. Let's get human beings into this, and we can match them with the right people, and then build networks around the people, not deliver them to the people.
Does this personal advocate not help? That's been mentioned.
The role of the mentor,
sorry,
is one that has become multifunctional when it comes down to programmes. And the term mentor has been stretched to cover a variety of roles, all of which, once again, are very well intentioned. But the idea of a mentor is to help someone to make decisions for themselves, to help them recognise that they have the place in society to make a decision for themselves, rather than to make that decision for them. And so the mentoring is also in a state of flux, and it has to learn how to, not to support people, but to guide people towards making decisions, not to do other things for them like that. Advocacy and mentoring are related, but are not the same.
I'll take Mr Gibbons, then I'll come back to you, Sandra. Mr Gibbons, you want?
Yeah. I think that's very well put. I think for people working in front line, the pathways are not just alien to the prisoners at times. The policies can be a bit sort of overbearing, and what I'm really pleased about, well, in Glasgow, is that people are actually looking at the quality side of what can be pulled from the documents and recognising that individuals within the prison, there isn't one size fits all. Some prisoners were starting to recognise actually don't like sitting in groups. For example, when we were talking about GP registration, we run a number of prisoner focus groups for people to say, this is what you're entitled to, this is what you should be asking for, and that's very positive. But for guys who don't want to engage with other people, we recognise that you have to go and see some people individually and offer them alternative ways of sort of trying to deal with some things. And some guys are fairly awkward. And I'm talking about guys because I'm working with males, but there's some people fairly awkward. But if you always just accept that they're awkward, you're always going to see them. So sometimes you've got to work round about looking for something that just breaks that chain. And we have got some tremendous workers, both within the NHS, within SPS, who really do make that effort. I'm not saying every day, but we kind of recognise that. And I feel there's a really positive feeling about some of the stuff that's happening just now. And I think people are going in the right direction. That's my gut feeling. And I'm not saying we won't get things wrong, but we're trying to move collectively in the right direction.
I think I'd like to make it clear that I do regard people who work in the SPS and in prisons as being human beings too, and erring is human.
You're both smiling at each other.
Absolutely.
I can see that.
But I think the intentions that are coming out of this are tremendous. The direction is fantastic. And I think it's just a question of remembering the right focus for this. The fact the SPS are now appointing through care officers to help look after prisoners through back into the community is a fantastic step forward, because up until this happened, SPS authorities stopped at the gate, and everything stopped at the gate at that point. And this is a fantastic opportunity to weave all these different things together into something that will support people well.
And I can think, I speak for the committee, nobody in the committee wanted that to happen because it's just such wastefulness. Yep. Mr McCune.
I wonder if next year when they're opening a HMP Grampian, which is a different kind of prison in as much as the prison population of HMP Grampian will broadly be indigenous to Grampian, that might offer, I suppose, a new structure for prisons, and it'll make some of the things that we've discussed a lot easier, because it'd be much easier then to have people seen by Grampian NHS staff in a Grampian prison with Grampian prisoners, and also I think much easier to get better involvement of local third sector groups, because they can literally go into the prison, see the prisoners, and then see them when they come out, and it's the same people. And we'll wait and see, but I've got great hope that that'll be a big step forward in terms of community prisons and community-facing prisoners. So.
Sandra?
Very much, Chair, and I do certainly concur with all the comments that have been made. Having visited Berlin, the amount of work that's been going on is fantastic, and anger management, etc., and the work from the SPS and voluntary organisations as well. But one of the things that struck me when I was talking to particularly the young, well, males anyway, but the young males, there was the revolving door syndrome that we're constantly talking about, and we don't want the reoffending to occur constantly. And one of the things we're talking about was the substance misuse. And I'm just a wee bit concerned that we haven't got that quite through care yet and continuity yet. And as you've said, each NHS board is looking at different ways to combat that and service the people who have got the substance misuse. And you mentioned networking and summary and collecting information. Well, if we're talking about continuity, as has been mentioned before, do you have a time scale for that? I mean, NHS boards working together is one idea better than another. I'm just a wee bit concerned that we don't have this, it's not gelled yet, and maybe it's too soon, but I would like to see some form of continuity, because that's one of the things that the people coming out of prison, if they've got a mentor, SPS, people they know, they've got a doctor, then they need access to help them, get off the substance misuse.
I'm watching negotiations going on between Miss Miller and Miss... I should have sat you side by side. I suggested to the clerks you should be side by side, unless Alison wants to sit in the middle, So which one's taking it? Okay.
I think that you've said there towards the end of what you were saying about working with people to reduce their addiction and ultimately anticipate that they will become drug or alcohol free. And that's a big ask, and as you know, there is a piece of work going on just now to look at the whole approach to addictions treatment, and I think people in the room have got views on that, and we maybe don't want to get into the debate about recovery versus treatment and methadone and all that kind of thing. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that when someone leaves prison, they are immediately picked up by local services. So there's not a gap. There's not this point in time where people are not getting their methadone. I think the challenge for us is to work with people in prison to reduce their addiction, not just their addiction to prescribed medication, as well as their addictions which has been treated through methadone or other treatments. That's, I think, the big challenge for us, so that while we've got people in that kind of safe place, if I can call it that, and we've got them as a captive audience who can work with them. And that's extremely challenging, I think it's fair to say, because, for all sorts of reasons, people don't want to reduce their prescribed medication. That's where we get most complaints about the efforts that people are making to reduce prescribed medication. Or they don't want to reduce their methadone level, and working with them around the benefits for that, and also looking at the consequences of that on the prison system, where people are maybe more likely to get involved in fracas with other prisoners or whatever. So I think it's something that's got to be managed very carefully, and it's got to be managed very carefully with the governor and the other staff in each prison, looking at the way the prison regime works, how we can work with the different prisoners on this. So it's quite complicated. But the bit about when you leave and you get picked up by local services, I think it's something that everyone is trying very hard to make sure that people don't fall between two stools, because we do know that when people go out of prison and if they overdose, I mean, that the probability of death is higher.
Before I take you in, Mr. White, are you on the same tack here, and then, or do you want to? Because I'll Mr.
All created, but let Mr. White go first.
Okay, thank you.
First of all, I think that we have to get it on board that it's very rarely a surprise when someone leaves prison through the gate, and so planning to work with that not from the last few weeks of a sentence, but from the beginning, to plan that pathway. Oh, sorry, trajectory. Trajectory.
The jargon, it just
I know,
intrudes.
it catches you. But that's where the planning should start, is as soon as possible at the beginning of the sentence and not at the end. Secondly, what passes as immediate service in the wider community sometimes isn't sufficiently immediate for somebody released on a Friday, because the gap immediate from Friday to Monday is a dangerous 2 days in between, and that leads to a lot of very sad problems. I think there's a tremendous model that's already been accepted across Scotland, Get It Right for Every Child, and I think that same holistic approach, not just to the individual involved, but to all the services involved, to have that all-embracing shared goal would be a marvellous model to use as a template for some of what's being talked about here.
Graham.
First of all, good morning, and thanks very much for taking time to come through and speak to us this morning. I'm glad I gave ground to Mr. White. He saved me saying much of what he's just said there just now, and I've said at previous meetings. I think that in terms of dealing with this whole issue of drug and alcohol problems, one of the frustrations is that there seems to be a confused message across Scotland about expectations. What do we expect prisoners to manage during their time? What can they manage during their time with all the other problems that they have? And setting goals that can be agreed between the various players. I think the final thing I'll say before coming on to the questions is that I'd like to record, as a matter of fact, that we don't expect prisons to solve all our problems for us. It's almost as though once we put someone in prison, everything that they brought with them in terms of their baggage, you're going to sort. If that was the case, the rest of us would be queuing up at the gate too to come in for a visit. Having said
Speak
that,
for yourself, Graham.
Having said that, let me become small-minded and raise some issues with you. This month, the Ombudsman overview, the SPSO reported. He raised serious concerns about prisoners being denied access to complaints procedures. He indicated that he'd raised these concerns back in January, and he discovered that it still continues to be an issue across the prison service, and that there seemed to be a difficulty in allowing prisoners to go beyond the feedback stage. Now, such as the concern that he records, he includes it in this month's report. What's happening within the community? Why is this a matter of a comment from the Ombudsman, and what will be done about it?
Well, I think every board has I mean, I don't know if everyone in the room has read the Ombudsman's report, but he particularly was commenting on a case where an individual had to ask for a feedback form on more than one occasion before the individual was able to go to the full complaints procedure. and obviously has made a number of comments. Now, the Ombudsman has worked his way around every board over recent months, meeting with all the chief execs to talk about complaints in general and how complaints are dealt with. And I believe that at every meeting, I was certainly at the meeting in Glasgow, and at every meeting he has raised the issue about prison complaints and being satisfied that complaints are being dealt with appropriately, because it's only relatively recently that the Ombudsman process is applied to prison complaints as a whole, not just the NHS bit of it. What the general complaints process requires, which is mentioned in the Ombudsman's report, is that we in the NHS record all feedback and compliments when we get them, which isn't that often, but we do get them. So we have to record all of these now and report them, as well as reporting on formal complaints. And my understanding is that in the prison service prior to the transfer, every issue that was raised really about healthcare was dealt with as a formal complaint and was responded to. And what we have always done in the health service is have take the opportunity to try to resolve the issue with the individual informally before they go into the formal complaints process. So you would meet them and see what their issue is and try to sort it. And if we can't, then obviously escalate it to a formal complaints process. I think prisoners like the process of making the complaint, getting a response, and then in many cases they then made a claim for compensation for whatever it was. Putting in this informal route and using the feedback forms to enable that informal route has been difficult, and people haven't responded to it very positively. But it's not meant to be a constraint, and if somebody has a complaint, they have every right to go straight to the complaint, through to the formal complaints process. And even when they're going through the formal complaints process, you can still try to resolve the thing informally, and hopefully you may be able to do that, and that's it. But that's basically the process. There is a feedback form that is used so that you can actually record the feedback, because we have to formally record the feedback now.
Now, before you do that, Mr White, you were in comment on the same response. And then back
I understand the complaints procedure inside prisons has made a lot of very positive changes over the last few years, and a great number of matters have been resolved within the wing and within each prison quite effectively. I think that the process of complaining, if it involves filling in a form on the part of the prisoner, that's going to rule out over half of the prison population in the short-term wings because they can't read or write. Secondly, I think the idea of an informal intervention to prevent a complaint becoming formalised is a tremendous way of sorting things on both sides of the fence. One way it can sort it for the individual, but also it never gets recorded as being a complaint, which means that figures and targets can be looked at differently, and trends across prisons and across the whole estate can be missed. And part of the new process that's coming in due course, I understand, for independent monitoring of prisons, is there will be a national review of complaints to see if there is a trend of small complaints, of low-grade ones, which may not seem important to us here, but for people who are in prison, it becomes quite a major issue and can come out of proportion and lead to other problems. So I think it would be good if we can get the complaints procedure sorted out in a way that was realistic to solve the problem, but also one where the complaints were somehow taken on board so we could be aware of trends that would otherwise not be a problem. And as for prisoners making claims or hoping to get a complaint resolved in a way where they could make a claim, I think that's perhaps a bit of a generalisation in my experience.
In the past.
Yes, thank you, that's fine.
That certainly hasn't been my experience recently. All the feedbacks have to be recorded. And in Glasgow, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, these are reported to through the clinical governance process. So there is a forum which identifies every single issue that's been raised in the feedback, and then the response to that. So it's tracked, and you can see the trends. And in fact, most people seem to have their issues resolved quite satisfactorily, informally.
That's the case.
Yeah.
Can I just ask for an example, Graham, because I don't know if you're Mr McEwen and Mr Gibbons want to come. Give me an example of the kind of complaints, just so we have some specifics, you know, kind of complaints that... Mr Gibbons is going to come in with that.
Yeah. Majority complaints that I deal with every day that reach either comment forum or go on to become complaints, or they ask for a complaint specifically, will be about prescription drugs. and it is mainly most of them will mention a drug called gabapentin, which is a drug of choice that people prefer to be prescribed, and they will say that the GP has prescribed me X and I wanted Y. Some will only be comments. They're just saying they're not happy that that's happened, and some will say they want to take issue with that somewhere else or ask for a second opinion. One of the other things that's probably been excluded that people should understand as well is the Scottish Prison Service. When the old complaint system operated, they would deal with complaints and a legal claim. The NHS, when the prisoner makes a legal claim, don't go through the complaint process. They just deal with it and prisoners found that a bit hard to actually understand it first. So you could say, if you're writing to your lawyer and you've made a claim for this, we'll deal with that, but we don't need the complaint, we're actually dealing with it. And I think it's a far more effective system because you've not got two people answering the same sort of complaint, but it took a wee while for people to understand that, and it was a bit frustrating.
Mr McEwen, do you want to come in there? I noticed you were...
It's just a point of interest. I think there are certain groups of prisoners that are perhaps more manipulative or more inclined to make complaint. And we've certainly noticed since we've moved the sex offending population from Peterhead that our complaints have gone down, and I suspect to wherever they've moved to, they've gone up. So there is, you know, there are many cultures within different groups of prisoners where complaining is something that, you know, some do more than others.
Graham. Yeah, sorry, yep, I'll take you both again and then Graham back in.
Just to come back to the point that the Ombudsman makes, it's not just one case he's talking about, it's dozens he's speaking about. And he makes mention of the guidance, Can I Help You?, which was published more than a year ago. Now, I think many public services deal with manipulative customers, clients, prisoners, whatever you would want to call them. The complaint system can still process that through and hopefully recognise that shade. I think the key to what the Ombudsman's saying is, if you want to track how services are being delivered and whether there are underlying problems, if the prisoners are being denied access to complaints forms, and that's what it's saying here, and he's got evidence of that fact, it'd be nice to hear from the community that's represented here, how will you deal with that for the future, so that as part of your performance measures, we know that complaints are properly recorded and are being responded to properly. If you're not recording them, then everything's fine, because you don't know you've got a problem. And that bit about informal review and conclusion, someone outside the prison might say, it's easy to indicate it's been resolved, but the relationship within the prison between the prisoner themselves and the authorities can sometimes be difficult if you want to stand on your rights. That's what the form's there to initiate. So it's how will we deal with that for the future? It'd be nice just to hear something about that.
I'll take Ms McEwen first.
I think a key principle that most of us, regardless of which health board you're coming from, are signed up to, and it's a great principle, is to make the service in prison as close as possible to the services that people will receive within the community. And so I would be guarding against creating a different system or approach within the prison than you deploy within the community. And I think I just feel that that's really important in terms of rehabilitating and preparing people for life in the community. So I wouldn't personally favour creating special complaint systems within the prison that are vastly different from the community.
Government guideline, Can I Help You, that we're talking about here, that sets the procedures in place. So it's maintaining a standard of complaints recording. I don't see it to make your lives hard, but if the guidelines exist there and there's a process, if you've decided you're not going to use it, I think you better write to the Cabinet Secretary and let them know.
Yes.
All boards have had to review their complaints process in line with that, and certainly what we did, and I'm sure all the other boards have done this as well, was make sure that the prison complaints process sat within the board complaints process. And we've had discussions with our three governors about how we can ensure that information about how to make a complaint is available in the halls as well as in the health centres. We have posters up because we've talked about the posters, and Frank and I have had conversations about that. And so that people can go, people can't, although we have posters up which say, explain the Ombudsman's process, the Ombudsman won't actually take a complaint unless it's been dealt with locally.
No, we know that.
But the important thing is that boards now have to record all feedback. And it's not necessarily the prisoner. I mean, your point is absolutely well made about people not being able to fill in these forms themselves. So it's not always the prisoner himself who will, or herself, who will fill in the form. But actually getting it, what the complaint is, or the issue is recorded, is really important somewhere, so that we know at a more senior level that all the issues are being picked up and logged.
With respect, as they say, this is very specific that the Ombudsman is talking about. It's complaint forms not being made available to prisoners, they're being denied them. So whether they can read or write or not, it's impossible if you don't get the bit of paper to write on.
I think...
Can I ask you, would it be part of the process that you will look round the estate, and if there are staff who are denying forms, re-educate those staff members so that the appropriate processes will be in place?
Often the forms would be given by the prison officers, not necessarily by health staff. But I think that when I read that Ombudsman's report, what I felt that we should do about it was take the issue back to the network at our next meeting and have a discussion with all the boards about the complaints process and the learning from that report. And I think that's what we need to do. And we need to just check what everybody's doing.
I'm going to take Mr. White. He's waiting a while, then I'll take Mr. Gibbon.
I think that there's a number of things we can take on board here. We have the suggestion that there's a cohort of prisoners who have a tendency to complain and be difficult. And I think that we can also parallel that with some of the prison staff. Occasionally, in the good old days when the screw was a screw and not an officer, then there was a certain attitude that was applied. Now, the numbers involved of the staff behaving like that are diminishing greatly, and I'm very pleased about that. And I think that if we're going to be effective in our reducing prison population through reducing offending, the number of prisoners who are in and causing complaint and by being difficult inside will also reduce. And I think it's a cultural thing that we have to get through. The denial of access to a complaint form is one of the simplest, lowest grade forms of control. And where you get control like that and restriction, then you get this idea of people fighting against that in their own way. If there was a greater sense of purpose towards helping people recognise their own abilities and responsibility for taking decisions, I think we'd find there was a better balance in the way they behaved. And I think that also could help us in many other ways too.
Mr. Gibbons, before we come back.
I think when the new process was introduced, one thing that shouldn't have been overlooked, and I overlooked it, and I work in the prison, is that probably it is an institution, and the staff have spent longer there than most of the prisoners. And with any new process, it takes a long time for people to understand what their role is in that process. And we actually had to spend some time working out some very basic processes and what should happen should somebody request. I thought it would be fairly straightforward, but it turned out not to be, because what the process is just now is they ask to see the nurse and they meet the nurse, and that means if they can't fill out the form, they can act as an advocate for that. But what was happening was previously the officers in the gallery handed a CP3 form, which was a medical complaint form, and it was just handed to them. But now there's a bit more work because the nurse comes in, she needs a room, they sit down, and so a lot of folk, when they were asking for a complaint form, initially the officers had been saying, we don't have complaint forms now, you need to deal with the NHS, nothing to do with us. So some people, technically speaking, would be denied. And I had a meeting with I had a meeting, and we sort of replicated this in Greenock and Low Moss, but I had a meeting with Martin MacDonald, who's the Deputy Governor, and we actually said, should that come about now, that we're saying to prisoners, you will fill out a CP1, which is a prisoner complaint form that goes to the first line manager, and the CP2 goes to the Deputy Governor, saying, I cannot access a medical complaint or a healthcare complaint. And that lets him know that his staff have got a bit of an issue. So, and he's actually met with every first line manager now in our establishment and said, this should happen. And the process is bedded in. It's actually starting to pick up now to nearer to something I recognise and appreciate. But the thing about prisoners as well, I just wanted to add, although a lot of the complaints you could say are manipulative and a lot of them are the same thing, there is a number of complaints that we take very seriously in terms of, and you see complaints where people have been falling short for various reasons, and there's some really, the good thing about the clinical governance groups is they're actually taking some of the learning for that, and we're looking at how can we stop that happening again. And the communication is getting better, and hopefully it should get better over time. But I do think there was real issues at the start, and it took us a wee while to bottom out why this complaint thing was an issue.
Graham.
Thanks very much for that, and hopefully having discussed it today will help deliver further understanding, because I think it's still a difficulty. An organisation learns from its complaints procedures if it sees it in a positive light. If I can ask a brief question, I don't expect a long time is available to you to answer this one, but on occasions there's been issues raised about the budget transfer from the old SPS into the health service, and whether or not there was enough money there to deliver the services that were required. Having experienced 18 months of the transfer, are members reasonably comfortable with the way things are working? Is there enough money in the purse to do what's necessary, given the current constraints?
Mr McEwen, you indicated.
I think broadly speaking, to run the service as it is, the transfer was sufficient, certainly in Grampian. And in terms of our review of expenditure, we're actually recording a slight underspend against the budget we were given. I think the big challenge that we have is, as the prison service redesigns its estate and redistributes prisoners, then those budgets are required to be reviewed. And I know that the directors of finance for the NHS are doing that. By the end of the year, I think they're using a component of the National Resource Allocation Committee to re-look at how budgets are going. So we won't be in a position where Grampian, for example, in 2014 will have a female prisoner population without a budget for that, and conversely, somewhere like Forth Valley may not have a prison but have a prison budget. So it's fairly fundamental that there's a review of how the budget is redistributed going forward.
And with Forth Valley being brought in there, do you want to comment, Mr McGee?
Could maybe highlight one of the areas causing concern. If you look at the future needs of prisoners, especially if we look at Glen Oakle, for instance, the sex offender population, a considerable amount, approximately 150 of them, are fairly elderly with long-term conditions. Now, we've never really factored that in at all. For instance, we've got 3 individuals requiring palliative care, 1 in dialysis, etc. So there is very complex healthcare needs for the long-term prisoner that I don't think we've really had on our horizon at the beginning of the transfer. I think we really had to consider that. I appreciate in an ideal world we may consider compassionate leave for some individuals, but looking at the certain characteristics of the prison population at Glen Oakle, it would be impossible to release some prisoners back to the local community. So the prison itself will be there for that individual for the rest of their life, potentially. And as I say, a lot of these prisoners now are presenting with quite significant long-term conditions that we really need to address in the future. So I think if you're asking if the budget's appropriate, it may well be appropriate this time, but looking 5-10 years hence, I think there is a real issue there.
I'll take Ms Parker now, she hasn't been in yet. Yes, Ms Parker.
Thank you. I think in response to colleagues in NHS, prison service has had a significant amount of change since the transfer. In particular, we opened Low Moss, which was an increase in service provision for Greater Glasgow and Clyde. The transfer, as Mr McGee rightly says, of sex offenders from Peterhead to Glen Oakle, and the change of population for Mr McEwen to local up in Peterhead. Then the ongoing work for the new prison in HMP Grampian, the changes that will bring, and the outcome of the Women's Commission report and the significant planning involved in that, which has meant some transfer of females from Cornton Vale to Pullman. So there has been a significant change, and prison projection, the numbers are, although sitting around 8,000, likely to increase to some 9,500 as we move forward in the forthcoming years. And as Mr McGee has rightly highlighted, complex needs in all the population, whether it be young people, women, certainly the emerging issues in relation to managing older people, and some of the historic sex offenders, long-term sentences, and the examples that Mr McGee has given. So from an SPS perspective, we certainly have a duty of care in regard to managing the population and work closely with health boards to share our information as soon as we know it in relation to planned transfers, whether that be the opening of new prisons or sometimes quite short-term planned or unplanned transfers also. So I think the points are rightly made.
On the prison figures, you said some 9,500, I think, was your...
Projections are 9,500 by 2020.
And does that, if we ended early release, what would that figure be? I mean, that's one of the issues, isn't it?
Significantly more, yes.
Which would be another, funding problem to end it. I mean, I think I'm in principle in favour of it, but I'm looking at...
Forecast of the 9,500. Yeah. What are the kind of proportions within that 9,500? There's always been a worry about the number of remand prisoners within it. That 9,500, that about long-term prisoners, short-term prisoners? What's the forecast?
I don't have that
I'll tell you what would be useful.
Just a global number.
Yeah, what would be useful, Ms Parker, is that if, with that figure, bearing in mind that, breaking it down into the categories that was mentioned, plus if we ended early release, what that projection would be, it would give us some idea of the pressures on the prison service, notwithstanding in the health side of it. That would be very useful. Because I think I wasn't aware of so many older prisoners for various reasons of public safety can't be released, and the cost is something that I think I hadn't really considered. I want Alison in now. So Alison's waited a wee while, then I'll let you, and I've got Roderick after it.
Thank you, Convener. Mr McEwen mentioned that you wanted to get to the point that we had an equivalence of provision of healthcare within the prison and within the community. And one of the areas where I think we've quite a long way to go yet is round about mental health. And I read with interest the interim report that the National Prisoner Healthcare Network Mental Health Subgroup, which was submitted to the committee, and I think it sets out in detail the kind of challenges that are facing you there. So I'd be interested in exploring with you how you're going to take this forward. What is your vision? When do you think we'll get to the point where we have that equivalence of care? Bearing in mind particularly the HM9 Inspector of Prisons report into Cornton Vale, where he made it very clear he believes that there are many, many women in that prison that ought to be in psychiatric hospital rather than in prison. So, can I ask?
Okay, well, maybe if I kick up on that. The Mental Welfare Commissioner are about to do a review of mental health needs for women prisoners as well, so that will be interesting to see what comes out of that. And the report you've got is a draft report, and it's out for consultation just now in response from the board. So we're all looking at it and will respond. And there are some issues in that I think people wouldn't necessarily agree with. There are issues about potentially running a kind of joint mental health alcohol service, and that's not necessarily what every board would want to do. And I think it depends on your size, to be perfectly honest, or the size of the prison and what is actually feasible. And my preference would be for the bigger prisons to have a separate service, recognising that there can be comorbidities, but to have a separate service. And I think one of the big issues for us, which is identified in that report, is the issue of personality disorder and how we tackle that. And we're doing some work, kicking off some work in Glasgow to we've talked earlier about the homeless service, and we have specific services for people with personality disorder in the homeless service. So we're going to do some training for prison officers and for staff in dealing with people who have a personality disorder, which I think is a first step to improving the working relationship and understanding what it is what some of the issues are that people have. But I think we're probably at the stage for most boards where we're taking that report, looking at how our local services measure against that, and what it is we still need to do differently. And one of the critical bits is about making sure that the forensic service, the mental health service, forensic service, links appropriately in with prisons, and we don't have people sitting in prison waiting for an NHS bed for any reason, if we can avoid that, because that has happened. So that's probably my initial response. I don't know if people want to add to that.
I'll probably be interested to hear from Forth Valley.
I was going to ask Mr White's been waiting, and then I'll hear from... Not that one, right? Mr McGee.
So, in relation to mental health, within Forth Valley, obviously, Court and Vale, the majority of women, as you say, come from very chaotic lifestyles, and a lot, sadly, tragically, actually want to come into hospital because it's the only time they can actually, into prison, it's the only time they can actually really kind of engage with healthcare services, etc. So, but we have to ask ourselves, is prison the ideal environment for these women? I would suggest not. But as I say, we're undertaking a needs assessment, looking at the specific needs, and on the back of the Mental Welfare Commission visits, we'll hopefully have a more accurate picture. But certainly, as I say, anecdotally, we find that a lot of women are actually almost wishing to come into prison to actually get their health services, because they just don't engage. They have such a chaotic lifestyle out there that, you know, prison seems to offer the safe environment for them.
I can recall a sheriff actually saying didn't really want to put the woman into prison, but for her own sake, so that she could get help. And that was a terrible indictment of what there was outside, but she had very little opportunity except to put them in prison to help them have the attention they needed. Ms Miller, followed by Mr White after that.
I just wanted to bring to the committee's attention some of the work that's going on with telehealth at the moment, and certainly NHS Lothian, the psychiatrist there, is doing some quite good work with seeing the patients, and they've got female and male prisoners in Lothian, so he's seeing both types of prisoners for their first assessment. He's doing a face-to-face, but doing quite a bit of follow-up via telehealth, and it's something that all boards are looking at with interest, and it seems to be having some quite good results. And he's also doing work with people with challenging behaviours, which again we're waiting with interest to see.
I hope this happens. I've been hearing about telehealth in here for far too long. When I chaired health and sport, we were talking about telehealth. You know,
it's got such tremendous potential.
Yeah, but everybody says that, but nothing. It seems to move at the pace of a slug. Can I just take Mr White, then I'll have Colin in with a supplementary.
You're in certainly Edinburgh area anyway, from what I can remember having seen it brought in about a year or two back. It's actually been very, very effective in the general use outside.
Forgive me if I say we've been talking about this for about 7 or 8 years, and you know how wonderful it is. And certainly the slugs in my garden move quite fast, actually.
To a certain extent, the proof is it seems to be working in Edinburgh.
Yes, well, good for Edinburgh, but I just hope it accelerates a bit more than we don't hear about in another 4 years' time. Mr White.
I think, first of all, it's an appalling reflection in our society that a woman is sent to jail for her care. I think we need to look at that and feel appalled, and nothing more than that, really. The idea of prison numbers going up by 20% in the next 5 to 10 years is also appalling. And I think perhaps we can look at how the health of the public at large, including prisoners, can be addressed in a slightly more imaginative and constructive way by changing the ways and the options available to the people who sit on the bench and hand down jail sentences, to give them the opportunity to sentence somebody to something that's perhaps more restrictive than a DTTO, but to give them some chance to go and address the problems behind their offending behaviour without going to prison, and perhaps without having to leave their home and without leaving the community, so they can remain as part of where they are, but also address their issues. That has to be a robust and imaginative process, but that would be one thing we could do that would cut down the number of people in prison, and it would also improve the family conditions and community conditions for everybody. I think it's also worth noting that the SPS have been taking on board an operational review where they're considering the asset-based approach towards looking at prisoners. If you take the asset-based approach and see where someone's strong points are rather than look where the deficits are, then the approach towards, for example, addictions can perhaps take on a different angle. And I think there's tremendous opportunity, as I said at the beginning. The transition we're going through just now is one that can offer great change. And that great change isn't just one that comes through in reports. It's one that comes through for human beings in the street and in their home, and also in the prison.
Well, I just point you towards the question I asked at first minute about home detention in Sweden, which I think is an option. I think the government is exploring where part of it would be to take on various rehabilitation that is suitable to that individual rather than put them in prison.
Absolutely.
And maybe keep their job, their family, their unit, if it's suitable.
Yes, I've had discussions with one progressive sheriff, and that's been very imaginative.
There's one progressive sheriff in Scotland, that's the headline.
Yes, exactly. and I'm sure...
No, he was not naming him or her.
and I'm sure there must be more, but the institution of being on the bench is perhaps even more resistant to change than prison officers used to be.
Oh heavens, you were doing so well. I think they're not bad, some of them. Can we move on? You want to come in, Miss Parker, there as well. Where are we? There we are.
To the women and the video conferencing that was discussed there, that Inverclyde will give us some real opportunities for innovative ways of working, new ways of working, and we clearly want to work with our health colleagues in the development of that establishment and to take forward some of what works and evidence-based, particularly in relation to women with mental health problems and addiction issues. And we've started that process, we've started that dialogue.
Alison, are you wanted to come back in at all?
No, I think it's an area that we need to just monitor the progress.
And of course we've got a separate interest in a sense in what happens to Cornvale and the women in it. Sandra?
I know that you mentioned, and I think Graham mentioned, it's about this increase in prisoners by 2020, and I think you asked for a breakdown of what that would mean, because, you know, being on the Justice Committee, probably the newest member of the Justice Committee, I've really been impressed with the work the Justice Committee does, and obviously we're looking at reducing...
You don't get extra questions for that?
No, I'm just a bit puzzled, you know, of all the good work that's going on in the prison and the addiction services and trying to stop people reoffending. I want to know where the figures come from and broken down, that there's going to be an increase. I'm very concerned about the fact that it's been mentioned when I thought a lot of good work was going on to, you know, decrease the prison population. Is that not what it's
I'm sure Ms Parker will provide us with her sources.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that.
And it's work that Scottish Prison Service are doing in relation, in partnership with the Scottish Government. So it's looking at the statistical information for the future.
So it's not from the Daily Record?
I would be more than...
I know you did. I'm just
really interested. Probably worse than that, but never mind.
We will get the details and the breakdown, because it is a figure that requires us to look at it.
Justice Analytical Services and Scottish Government are also looking at subgroups such as women and young offenders, so that information can be made available to the committee.
Happy?
When you see the figures.
No. Roderick, you're the last one, because I am going to stop at 11 or thereabouts.
My question is really geared towards Anne and Jane. We're kind of 3/4 of the way through your network. What work have you still got to cover in the remaining 6 months in terms of what's outstanding?
Oh, well, yeah, we can do. It's not our network, it's the board's network and the SPS network. It's everybody that's involved in it. And I mean, I think Jane will probably summarise what we've still to do. You've seen, I think in your papers for today, you've seen some of the reports that have been produced already, in particular the mental health one, which is, I think, a very good piece of work. And that's drawn together people from across the board, all of the boards, to contribute to that. But yes, there are a number of pieces of work that are still outstanding, and the network won't necessarily come to a stop in November 2013. We're doing a piece of work just now to review how we go forward and what we should have and whether it should function in the same way. So there's a questionnaire out just now to get people's views on that. and then we'll have a further discussion about what it is we should do, how we should pull it. I think we personally, I think we still need something and we need a forum where we can discuss issues that are emerging and where we can share learning, because there is a lot of shared learning and there are different approaches because of different systems. So I think we still need something, whether it's the same shape and form, that's for debate. But I'll let Jane summarise the kind of what we've achieved and what we're still to do.
Yeah, I mean, we spent probably the first 3 or 4 months of the network just developing the work plan and sort of getting everything out onto the table and finding out what boards wanted us to do. And some of the work that we took on was what we were calling legacy issues, which were pieces of work that started pre-transfer, and then we took them on, and then there was a lot of new work. And I suppose it's like most things, we could probably work for the next 10 years because people would always find us something to look at next. But in terms of the mental health, as Anne said, that's reported. We've just reviewed the information sharing protocol, which is about to go out to boards for sign-off. We're doing some work around records and how we transfer them to make sure that the electronic work goes on. There's a piece of work that will go on for probably the next 18 months around the clinical IT system, which is looking at introducing the prescribing module, which is the easy bit, because that's just the same as it would be in a practice. But because prisons work mainly as a primary care service, but they have this little bit of hospital service, which is the administration of medicines that you would find, there's a piece of work going on to try and make the IT system fit that sort of prescribing come administration, and that will take some development. So that probably will go on. In terms of performance measurement, we've now developed a set of short-term indicators, which I think I shared with the committee, which is about to go to boards now. It's out for comment. Hopefully boards will sign up to collecting that information. We'll move then on to looking at some of the more long-term indicators. There's through care, which, as I say, we're working with the third sector to see where that piece of work goes. Substance misuse we've talked about. So in the main, the work plan will be more or less delivered by the end of November, but there will still be pieces of work that we want to continue, and our job is to get some view from boards about how they want to take that forward in the future, whether we need the network to continue as it is or whether it's in a different shape or form.
Does Ms Parker want to come in here from the SPS?
As part of the network I'm well aware of the work that's being done and what's been achieved.
I'm going to do a round-up question just to ask, and please be frank, not that you've not been frank so far, pluses and minuses of the transfer from healthcare to NHS within the prison service. Big test is, are prisoners getting any healthier? And as you know, is it continuing through? So what are the pluses and minuses that you've met in this period? Well, I'll start at this side now. You gave me that look. Start with you, Mr. I'll start the right-hand side. What do you think?
I think the pluses take the number of 1, and that it's started. I think the transition is fantastic to the NHS, and I think that the process of the NHS linking up all the way through the prison sentence to back to the community is a fantastic opportunity that lies ahead of us to make that a reality, because that's one less disconnect for the prisoner from the community. So I'm all for it.
Mr. Gibbons.
I can see improvements in many areas, and they may have not came to fruition yet, but there's certainly huge advantages. Negatives, I'm not really sure what they would be at the minute. You know,
has there not been any friction, say, from within your own staff no longer being responsible for certain things? And
no, I think though for some staff it's taken a while. There's always because there was a group of staff already there who were working for the Scottish Prison Service. There is a feeling when you're first subject to TUPE or whatever, or you're joining the bigger NHS, that you know that it's a sort of inferior service. But I think, I'm hoping anyway, that a lot of the individuals have proved themselves to be sort of worthy professionals within NHS, and have as much to take forward. And we've certainly benefited from the expertise within NHS, because that's huge in terms of a huge resource for us, and probably overall we feel sort of better supported, people who have made the transition, although it would be maybe worth checking out in all areas.
Okay, Ms Parker.
For me, the work of the network has achieved what it's achieved to date. I think there's obviously a need to move that forward. The legacy issues have now been addressed, or will be addressed in the next 6 months or so. A real opportunity for improved through care, as Pete has said, and particularly in the pathway of substance misuse, and how health outcomes can contribute to reduced reoffending.
Mr McEwen.
I suppose two things. One that's been mentioned is the continuity of care between community and prisons. And I think a real opportunity for government and for boards to literally have a captive audience of core health inequality people to address health inequalities is certainly, I think, in our board agenda in Grampian, that's well recognised that we have this big opportunity, so that would be a plus. In terms of negatives, and I sound like a broken record here, but I say it quite a lot, I think with the benefit of hindsight, we should have tied the care of people in police custody and the prison health service together at the outset, whereas they've almost developed as two separate projects, but it's the same people at different stages in their pathway between community, prison and back to community. So to me that was a missed opportunity, but I think we're addressing that now.
I'll come back to that maybe. Yes, Mr McGee.
I think it's a learning experience for us all, the whole transfer process. I think encouragingly that I think healthcare staff working in prison now have a greater access to the wider NHS for clinical supervision. They now are encouraged to develop their nurse-led clinics far more than maybe previously, etc., which is having obviously an impact on the prison population. I think every day we seem to be learning new things, and possibly one area that's causing slight concern for ourselves is, I think I hinted earlier about the ageing prison population and how we deal with them, but there is a real issue. We've talked about the healthcare provision, but it's the social provision of prisoners. Who meets their personal care within the prison establishment? That's a real question I think we really have to address. We're aiming to mirror what's delivered in the community within our prisons through addictions and things like that. But when it comes to sort of personal care assisting for the elderly prisoner population, who actually undertakes these tasks? I think we have to have further discussion around
Who does it at the moment?
Who does it, yeah.
Who does it though?
At the moment, as I say, we have no overnight health care delivered within our prisons. So if a prisoner requires sort of care overnight, potentially the prison may well have to access a local authority commissioning separately, a sort of agency cover going in, etc. But it is a real problem that I think we have to consider for the future, especially, as I say, that cohort is just going to increase.
Thank you. Dr. Grogan.
For me, one of the key changes has been around the provision of medical services to prisoners, where there's more regulation, more governance in place, rather than the previous arrangements with the agency, a very transitional workforce who moved in and out, who had less accountability to any organisation and less support and training put in place for their development needs in dealing with this population. So I think the direct employment through the health service of the medical cover has been kind of a key change for me in improving the quality and some of the controls in place around the service. One of the challenges I think has been, and is still in place, are some of the processing issues that we have to deal with as part of general healthcare to prisons. And I think actually we can't develop a lot of services that we'd like to develop because we're constrained by some of the actual processes that are in place, processing prisoners when they come through. And where you're dealing with a prison like Berlin, where you have a high volume of prisoners coming through, then you can't actually often deal with their wider health needs, because you're busy ticking the boxes, almost dealing with prescribing issues, etc., that are processes, and we have started to make some inroads with that, but we may need to agree some changes to what has to be delivered in order to free up valuable nurse and doctor time to actually deal with some of the health inequalities.
Such as? What changes?
Well, for instance, every prisoner who's admitted through Berlin sees an SPS guard, then gets seen by a nurse, and then has to see a medical, has to see one of the doctors within 24 hours, regardless of the nurse assessment. So if we had a better triage system of nurse assessment, where only a number of individuals with medical needs would then have to see the doctor, rather than every prisoner coming in having to see the doctor. And I've actually worked in the service myself in Low Moss and been processing individuals who have absolutely no medical needs and have already seen a nurse, so any hidden needs or could have been identified earlier. We have issues around cardexes and prescribing that are systematic, where they have to be reviewed 3 monthly. So we inherited a system whereby doctors were reviewing the cardex and not the patient, and actually didn't have time to review patients that started new medication, because they were going through this churn of paperwork to try and maintain the service and the requirements of that. So I think we still haven't cracked that, and there are some systems in place that we've inherited which mitigate against actually delivering or allocating time towards improving health inequalities and dealing better with long-term conditions management.
Thank you for that. Dr. Graham.
Right. Well, you mentioned earlier, do we know if the health of prisoners has got better or worse? And I think that's one of the downsides. We still can't yet answer that question. But I do think that, and it's already been mentioned by Jane Miller, that the development by the network of these performance measures will go some way to be able to answer that question. And just for Mr. Pearson to note that complaints are actually one of the indicators that we've put in. So that's on the downside, but I think on the upside for me is certainly a coming together of health, justice and social care, what's beginning to sort of work together rather than being sort of things being done in sort of separate areas, and a recognition that there are, the common, there are common problems, but there are common solutions, and that's what I see as an upside.
Thank you. Ms. Miller.
Yeah, I think it's already been mentioned. I think it's been a tremendous learning curve for boards, because this was a population that traditionally health boards didn't really get involved with, because the care was provided by SPS, apart from some of the maybe outreach services that were going in. So it has been a learning curve, and I think boards are much more aware now of the health needs of prisoners, and also, as Frank said, the staff have access to the much wider NHS now, so they know the way through a health board, whereas in the past the SPS might have asked for help but didn't necessarily know where to go or what the services were. Now the staff are part of that NHS, so I think that's a huge advantage. Challenges just for me as a network is actually to encourage all boards to sign up to some of the guidance that we're putting out, because whilst we are developing guidance nationally, boards deliver the care, and that's absolutely right. So the challenges are getting boards to actually sign up and be part of what we're trying to do on a national basis.
Last word to Ms. Hawkins.
Yes. Negatives, I think the financial position for in particular Ayrshire and Arran, who have had a particular budget pressure, and this year they are covering that from their uplift. So if they were here, that's what they would say. And I think picking up on what Ruth was saying about a potential for the prison population to rise, which clearly would give us concern from a strategic perspective, then that may bring additional financial pressures, which we would clearly people would be concerned about. But I think that's far outweighed by the positives, which are probably mirroring some of what people have already said. From a strategic perspective, the relationships between criminal justice and health and local authorities have changed quite dramatically, and the opportunity for health to actually influence, to be involved in planning processes, so to be involved in the Peterhead planning process, the new prison, Women's Prison for Greenock, to be involved in projects like the Women's Justice Centre in Glasgow and actually influence that and ensure that we are playing into that. That would never have happened before, because we've now got the knowledge to actually be able to play into and to influence. And I think the other thing is that we've, when people went into prison in the past, before we had responsibility for the service, they were, from a health perspective, they were forgotten about, and they're not now. They feature on the, as Mark said, they feature on the board agenda. We have our, we all have our health improvement plans. We're looking at all of these issues like smoking, sexual health, etc., in just the same way as we're looking at the general community. So I think there are huge positives.
And I just say to members, thank you. I don't want any more questions from members. Nothing to stop members actually writing and asking questions out with this. And if there's anything that, I mean, that was actually a very interesting roundup. Some issues were plopped in, at the last minute. So if you want to give us anything further that you feel, well, I didn't think to say it at the time, but I'd like to say it now, just write to me as convener and we'll circulate it to the other members. But thank you very much, a very useful follow-up. And I'll suspend just for a couple of minutes, but stay put, members, we're not going anywhere. Thank you. Well, you will shortly, but that's so. Thank you very much, yes. And moving on to item 3, subordinate legislation. It's consideration of one negative instrument, the Children's Legal Assistance Fees and Miscellaneous Amendments. Scotland Regulations 2013, SSI 2013-144 makes provision about the fees that can be charged by solicitors and counsel when providing assistance by way of representation or legal aid in relation to hearings and proceedings under the Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011. The Subordinate Legislating Committee is content with this instrument. They're content with something. It's excellent. Do members have any comments on SSI 2013-144? Are members content to make no recommendation in relation to this instrument? Thank you very much. We now move into private session.